Yes, it's 1 minute past 4 p.m. So I think we can start. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the opening lecture of the Spring 2022 series of the Speaking from the Margins lectures. My name is Krieble. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the DBB team. And especially, I would like to mention my colleagues, Floris Bernard and Anne-Sophie Ruckhout, whom I thank for the conceptual and practical organization of these events. It's a pleasure for me to see so many of you here on the screens today to listen to a very welcome speaker, Brad Hostetler, who is an assistant professor of art history at Kenyon College. He specializes in the study of ekphrasis in Byzantine art, Byzantine epigrams on objects, and especially epigrams inscribed in relics and reliquaries. And today, this afternoon, he will guide us towards a journey into ekphrasis and epigrams on Byzantine art. A couple of practical announcements. So during the lecture, the chat will be closed. But at the end of the lecture, there will be ample time for discussion. So you can pose your questions to the speaker live or write them down in the chat. Feel free to switch your cameras on if you like. And it rests me now to pass the floor to Brad for his lecture, please.
Thank you, Raquel and Sophie and Floris, and thank you to the DBBE team for the invitation to speak today. The database in this lecture series has been such a tremendous resource, and it's an honor to contribute to their work in a small way. Hopefully I'm coming through. Is everything okay with the sound? Okay. The term ekphrastic epigram has been used to denote verse inscriptions that describe works of art. This term is a modern designation and not one that is attested in ancient or Byzantine sources. Scholars use this term in accordance with the modern use of the term ekphrasis. In Antiquity and Byzantium, ekphrasis was a rhetorical description of all sorts of subjects, people, places, things, events, but is today applied exclusively to descriptions on works of art. The use of the term ekphrastic epigram is also problematic in that these inscribed texts only rarely deliver a precise and complete description of their subject. The descriptive elements are selective in order to draw the viewer's attention to specific aspects of the object or image. Despite its inaccuracy and anachronism, the term ekphrastic epigram does raise the question whether an epigram on a work of art shares any features with rhetorical ekphrases. It seems like a logical relationship. Ekphrasis was the method of describing, and epigrams were words about art. As shown by Henry Maguire in his foundational study, Art and Eloquence in Byzantium, rhetoric permeated the thinking of the Byzantines to the extent that it influenced the composition, iconography, and arrangement of images in church-painted programs. Building on this idea, I examined whether there are any features of rhetorical ekphrases that could be found in epigrams. First, we need to understand what an ekphrasis is. According to the program Nazmata, the handbooks used in Byzantine rhetorical education, an ekphrasis is, quote, descriptive language, bringing what is shown clearly before the eyes. Ancient sources are clear that an ekphrasis is very different from a straightforward description. While description was meant to convey the facts of a particular subject, ekphrasis was meant to, in Ruth Webb's words, open up those facts through the quality of enargia, or vivid language. To compose an ekphrasis, the order began with a mental image of a person, place, event, or object, and described that thing with such vividness and clarity that the listener could imagine it as if it was in front of them. In so doing, an ekphrasis helped the listener envision and experience the subject, and as Liz James states, quote, to convey the effect of the perception of a particular object had on the viewer, appealing to the listener's imagination. It was believed that all mental images were based on the memories of actual images and experiences. Byzantine art would, therefore, serve as an immense reservoir of iconographic compositions that could be invoked, imagined, and immediately understood by a Byzantine audience. If we limit our focus to ekphrases on works of art, we know that some were performed in front of the works they were describing. In such instances, ekphrases would operate in parallel with the image, not replace it. Pictures are static, but ekphrases of those pictures unfold in time. When brought together, they expand the ways in which viewers and listeners could experience the images perceived by the visual and verbal. One well-known example of an ekphrasis that was recited in front of a work of art is that by Photius for the newly installed apse mosaic in Hagia Sophia, delivered on Holy Saturday on March 29, 867. In the middle of this homily, Photius breaks into an ekphrasis of the mosaic image. A virgin mother with a virgin's and a mother's gaze, dividing in indivisible form her temperament between both capacities, yet belittling neither by its incompleteness. With such exactitude has the art of painting, which is a reflection of the inspiration from above, set up a lifelike imitation. For as it were, she fondly turns her eyes on her begotten child in the affection of her heart, yet assumes the expression of a detached and imperturbable mood as the passionless and wondrous nature of her offspring, and composes her gaze accordingly. When we look at the extant mosaic, we find that Photius's description doesn't align with the external reality. He described the Mother of God gazing at her son, but the mosaic shows her upright, stiff, and looking straight ahead. Maguire notes that this duality of emotions is a topos in ancient ekphrases. He also suggests that this topos was intentionally and meaningfully deployed by Photius in order to convey two of Mary's aspects. On the one hand, she is the imperturbable virgin, and on the other, she is the affectionate mother. While the image appears to emphasize the former, Photius balances the scales by overemphasizing the latter. Photius sets out not to document the mosaic's external features, but rather to provide an exegesis on the image by narrating the emotions and the spiritual truths that it conveys. In the words of James M. Webb, Photius was, quote, articulating things which cannot be seen with the physical eyes, end quote. How does the nature of ekphrasis relate to epigrams? The term ekphrastic epigram is a misnomer because it isn't an ekphrasis in the technical sense. Prose has traditionally been the medium of ekphrases, and the need to achieve a vividness of speech would have been more difficult in verse, given its metrical constraints. Inscribed epigrams, therefore, present a double challenge, in that they also constrain the writer to a limited number of verses. As Mark Locksterman observes, epigrams inscribed on works of art are too short to elaborate on the, quote, emotional depth and narrative width that is required to develop ekphrastic themes. Length was necessary for the words to flesh out the imagery, emotions, and dialogue that was needed to achieve the quality of enargia. I don't suggest that epigrams on works of art are ekphrases in the technical sense. Just because an epigram describes some aspect of an object's physical appearance doesn't mean that it's ekphrastic. It's descriptive, yes, but not necessarily ekphrastic. As we have seen, a description becomes an ekphrasis by its quality of enargia, its vividness. This vividness has to do with one's imagination and how the picture is formulated in the listener's mind and how they are able to see and experience what isn't outwardly visible. In this way, the work of art and the ekphrasis work together to activate certain images in the imagination of the listener. My question then is whether epigrams on works of art could activate the imagination in a similar way. While they are not ekphrases, do they possess certain ekphrastic qualities that allow them to function as abridged ekphrases? To address this question, I focus on the epigram found in the beginning of the so-called Menilogen of Basil II. This is one of the most sumptuous Byzantine manuscripts surviving to us. Made for the Emperor Basil II sometime after 979, the Menilogen measures 37 by 32 centimeters and contains 434 pages. While called a Menilogen, it's actually a synaxarion in that it contains short readings from the lives of saints that could be read throughout the ecclesiastical year. It only contains readings for September through February, meaning that there was originally a second volume covering the second half of the year. Each folio features a header text that identifies the day and the saint who is being commemorated, a half-page miniature illustrating a scene from that saint's life, and the short reading written in 16 lines. The epigram is found on the front of the manuscript, on the recto side of the first folio of a bifolium. It's composed of 28 dodecasyllable verses. Here now, rightly contemplate, O beholder, the best work made of the best deeds, a most beautiful work of God, astounding to the mind, a work that rightly delights all creation. For above himself as God and Lord, having painted with a circling dance of stars the heavens, which by his word he stretched out like leather, to illuminate the world by his all-wise forethought. And below, the one who imitates him by his manner, the ruler of the whole earth, Basil, son of the purple, the offspring of the purple robes, exceedingly mighty in both victories and words, made this book, truly like another heaven, stretched out from leather, as is natural, bearing beautiful pictures like stars. First, that of the God-man Logos himself, then that of his mother who gave birth without seed, of wise prophets, martyrs, apostles, of all righteous, angels, archangels. He gladdens the minds of the Orthodox and delights in the loveliness of every spectacle, but for all those he had depicted in colors, may he find the active helpers, collaborators in his dominion, allies in battles, redeemers from afflictions, healers of sicknesses, but more so in the judgment before the Lord, passionate mediators and providers of unspeakable glory above and the dominion of God. The epigram suggests that it was associated with an image that featured God above and Basil below. However, the manuscript doesn't contain such an image. The verso of this folio and the recto of the next are blank, and these are followed by the series of synaxarion entries. Ihor Shevchenko suggests that the image could have been removed or that it was planned for one of these blank pages, but was never executed. We will come back to this possible image later. But now I want to draw our attention to three features in this epigram that might suggest a relationship with ekphrases. Again, I'm not arguing that this epigram is an ekphrasis, but rather that it borrows some elements from this form of writing in order to open up ways in which to view this manuscript. The first ekphrastic feature of this epigram is to connect the viewer with the work of art. It does so by drawing the viewer's attention directly to the manuscript. The viewer is addressed in the vocative in the first verse, and they are asked to look and contemplate the work before them. It's not clear what this work was, whether it was the specific image or the manuscript as a whole. Epigrams have a history of invoking the viewer. This was traditionally a feature of funerary epigrams, where a general passerby would be called upon to stop and look at a monument and mourn the deceased. But over time, and especially in the Byzantine era, the viewer became more and more present in epigrams for all sorts of objects. The insertion of a beholder ensured that the performative nature of poems inscribed on stone, metal, and parchment could be activated. Calling the viewer's attention to the work of art was an essential ingredient of ekphrases. In his description of the Church of the Holy Apostles, Nicholas Meserides makes explicit invocations to the viewer by calling on them, commanding them to look, and asking them questions about what they are seeing. He enlivens his description of narrative scenes with dialogue and reflections of emotions of the figures depicted in the mosaic. All of this was to give the ekphrasis and the enargia needed to not just see the images, but to relive the scenes as if they are unfolding before them. In his description of the image of the disciples running to see the risen Christ in Galilee, Meserides ends with a direct address to the onlookers, one that appeals to their imagination. Imagine, onlooker, if we had become their fellow competitors and were racing to the line, we would see droplets of sweat pouring down their faces, which they wipe away with a flick of their fingers, flinging these drops of congealed sweat as far as possible. Why was calling the viewer's attention to the work of art such an important feature of ekphrases? While directing the viewer to the image helped them see its outward characteristics and features, this wasn't the only or even the primary function of an ekphrasis. An ekphrasis was also meant to activate images in the listener's mind, to make listeners into spectators, in order to see what wasn't present. Meserides describes this process when he begins his ekphrasis of the interior of the Holy Apostles. We have reached the point of our speech where we survey the interior of the church with our outer eye, but seek to understand it with our inner. Guided by the inferior faculty of sight, the mind is capable, on the basis of sense data, of grasping essential truths and of penetrating to the threshold of the innermost mysteries. But it is incapable of even glimpsing these if the faculty of sight alone serves as a guide. It is my purpose to build this house of the Lord with words as materials and with the mind as architect, so that I and all devotees of the apostles will have a chance to see the beauty of the apostles' house more distinctly and more clearly. So when Meserides calls upon the viewer to look, he isn't only asking them to look at the material image on the wall of the church, but to also see the mental image that he is building and painting in the mind of the listener. Here is where true understanding of the works of art can be grasped. And in order to do so, he mustn't simply describe the image, but expand upon it. As demonstrated by Webb, the difference between pure description and ekphrasis is the impact on the listener. This is why Meserides calls upon his viewers to imagine the sweat dripping from the brows of the apostles. Droplets of sweat would not have been part of the mosaic, but Meserides includes them in order to build the image in the mind of the listener. He wants them to be moved and to perceive and experience that biblical event. Such engagement is also suggested by the Menilogen epigram, where the viewer is asked in the first verse to behold and contemplate the work of art in front of them. But what made this activation of sight and imagination possible was that any image that would have accompanied this epigram would not have been visible while reading the epigram. If an image was meant to be painted or is missing from the open bifolium, then it would have been placed in the following pages and thus would only be visible when turning away from the epigram. The same is true with the codex as a whole. While the reader or listener of the epigram would have seen and felt the physical weight and size of the manuscript, they wouldn't have been able to look at all of the contents described by the epigram. So from the very start, we have an epigram that asks the beholder to contemplate this great work without the viewer having the ability to actually see all of its contents. By its very placement within the codex, the epigram acts as a force on the listener to conjure up an image in their imagination. The next ekphrastic feature I want us to consider for the Menilogen epigram is structure. Following the invocation of the beholder to contemplate this work of art, the epigram then describes an image, or at least an imagined image, with a two-part composition that includes at least God above in the heavens and the Emperor Basil II below on earth. Such two-part compositions are quite common in Byzantine art. One relevant example is found in the Psalter also made for Basil. This full-page illumination features the emperor standing on a dais, armored and armed. Christ reaches down from the ark of heaven with a crown in his hand. At the upper left and right, the archangels Michael and Gabriel deliver him a spear and a crown. 6 bust images of military saints flank the emperor. 8 men crouch in proskynesis at his feet. The folio facing this illumination features an 11-verse dodecasyllable epigram. A new wonder is to be seen here. Christ extends from heaven with his life-bearing right hand, the crown, the symbol of power, to Basil, the faithful and mighty ruler. Below are the first among the angels. One, having taken the crown, has presented it and joyfully crowns Basil. The other, linking power to victories and bearing a lance, a weapon which terrifies enemies, places it in the hand of the emperor. The martyrs fight along with him as a friend, throwing down the enemies lying at his feet. This image may in fact be the kind of composition that is described by the Menilogen epigram, where Christ is depicted in the heavens and Basil on earth. Both epigrams describe the image in that order, beginning with the top of the composition and moving down. The Psalter image in epigram expands the cast of characters to include the martyrs who flank the emperor and the enemies who lie at his feet. Describing one's subject from top to bottom was the ideal structure for ekphrases according to the instructions given in the Progymnasmata. It's also the order that is followed in many ekphrases, including one by an anonymous author for the Emperor Manuel I Komnenos. As demonstrated by Lynn Jones and McGuire, this ekphrasis was for an image of the emperor, likely central and dominating the composition, symmetrically surrounded by 8 horsemen, 2 graces or personifications that deliver crowns, and an image of Christ in the heavens. On the one hand, a clear and logical organization of an ekphrasis has a practical function. It allows the listener to see the image as it is painted in their imagination. On the other hand, an orderly structure can reveal other meanings. In these instances, the top to bottom approach to describing the image can be a way to economically impress on the mind a certain kind of diagrammatic hierarchy in which the emperor is the centerpiece to which all other actions and figures are directed. In the ekphrasis of Manuel, we first learn about the horsemen in all of their variety dashing across the plain, but then it becomes immediately apparent that they are just side acts to the main attraction at the center, the emperor, who is described in excruciating detail from his head down to his feet, from top to bottom. The description of Manuel alone takes up approximately 3/4 of the entire ekphrasis. As the text unfolds, it becomes apparent that whatever heroic deeds were achieved by the horse riders, they serve as mere prelude to the focus of the scene, Manuel. In the epigrams in Basil's Menilogen and Psalter, we also see a top-down description of an image, but in a much more abridged format. Here, the structure is followed in order to communicate larger ideas that can't be compressed within these short texts. Here, the top-down composition allows a listener to visualize the emperor's place within the cosmos. For the Menilogen epigram, Basil's relationship vis-a-vis God is conveyed not just spatially, above and below, but also by the shared acts of creation. God creates the heavens, and Basil creates this manuscript. The Psalter epigram also follows the top-down description of the image, but expands on Basil's position by including military saints who fight alongside him, placed on the same lateral plane as the emperor, and ending with the enemies in proskinesis, placed at the lowest section of the composition. It should be noted that the Menilogen and the Psalter epigrams could have structured their descriptions in any sequence. I suggest that they use the top-down approach not simply as an organizational method, but also to communicate from where power is positioned in the image. In the Menilogen epigram, Basil is situated as the sun, a rhetorical topos to be sure, but also a succinct way to communicate his position. As the one who imitates God above, he is the central light around which all saints coalesce. This cosmological imagery, reinforced by the top-down organization of the epigram, allowed the poet to condense complex ideas regarding the superpowers of the emperor. Even without an image to aid the reader, these ideas could be visualized in the mind in diagrammatic fashion and immediately comprehensible, thanks in large part to the epigram's ekphrastic-like organization. We now turn to the third ekphrastic feature of this epigram, materiality and making. By this, I don't mean a list of materials that one might find in an epigram on a work of art, but rather how those materials reflect on the object's construction and artistry. This is a feature of the prototypical ekphrasis, Homer's description of the Shield of Achilles. When the armor is ordered, Homer doesn't simply jump into a description of their component parts in iconography, but rather begins with Hephaestus firing up the bellows and working the metal. Hephaestus went to his bellows and he turned them toward the fire and commanded them to work. And the bellows, 20 in all, blew on the melting vats, sending out a ready blast of every force, now to further him as he labored hard, and again in whatever way Hephaestus wished, and his work went on. And the fire he put stubborn bronze and tin and precious gold and silver, and then he set on the anvil block, a great anvil, and took in one hand a massive hammer, and the other he took the tongs. We also see this emphasis on materials and making in Paul the Salentiary's description of Hagia Sophia. When he turns his focus to the marbles within the church, he doesn't simply describe their appearance, but also reflects on the masons quarrying the stone and fitting them into place. Upon the carved stone wall, curious designs glitter everywhere. These have been produced by the quarries of C. Gert Proconesus. The joining of the cut marbles resembles the art of painting, for you may see the veins of the square and octagonal stones meeting so as to form devices. Connected in this way, the stones imitate the glories of painting. These have been fashioned with cunning skill about the holy building, that it may appear bathed all around by the bright light of day. Yet who, even in the thundering strains of Homer, shall sing the marble meadows gathered upon the mighty walls and spreading pavement of the lofty church? Mining tools have toothed steel have cut these from green flanks of Charistus and have cleft the speckled Phrygian stone. In both Homer and Paul, we see an emphasis not just on the materials, but on the ways in which the raw materials have been mined and quarried with great effort, and have been brought together in ways that were wondrous. Homer describes the raw materials of bronze and tin as stubborn, and that Hephaestus submitted them to the bellows with gold and silver to create the beautiful and intricately decorated shield that Homer then describes in some 130 verses. For Paul, he also describes the excavation of the raw materials with metal tools and how the slabs of marble have been set in such a way that they imitate painting. He praises the ways in which the craftsmen have combined the stones into a marvelous meadow of colors. We find a similar interest in materials and making in the Menilogen epigram. While the manuscript is a marvelously illuminated work through the collaboration of at least 8 artists, it's the parchment that is the focus of the epigram. It begins with a description of God who creates the heavens stretched out like leather and painted it with a circling dance of stars, thereby illuminating the entire world. Any image that may have accompanied this epigram likely did not represent Christ performing these precise actions, as existing Middle Byzantine images of creation don't typically represent it in this manner. It's not until a painted program at the Periclesian of the Cora Monastery that we find an image of the scroll, of the heavens as a scroll like that described by the Menilogen epigram. The description being used here, where creation of the world is like the production of a manuscript, is done so to then link it to our imperial patron and his book. Basil imitates God by performing his own act of creation, but rather than heaven being stretched out like leather, Basil stretches out sheets of leather like another heaven. He is presented as the artist who has transformed these mundane materials into something that is comparable to the acts of God. The description of Basil's manuscript is more than just a list of materials and iconography. It's a description of the act of making the manuscript. In so doing, the epigram conjures up in the mind the visceral, laborious, and physical nature of the book's creation. Once the skin of the animal had been harvested, it underwent a series of preparations that included soaking it in lime to loosen the hair, scraping any remaining hairs and flesh, soaking it again in fresh water to wash off the lime, stretching it on a wooden frame, scraping the surface, and continually stretching the skin to achieve the desired thickness. It was a labor-intensive and time-consuming process to create just one sheet of parchment. The description of the manuscript's creation by the epigram prompts the reader and listener to contemplate these processes that led to its existence. In conclusion, the Menilogen epigram is many things. It's a dedication that names the emperor for whom it was made and offers a prayer on his behalf to the holy figures represented in the book. It's an encomium that praises the emperor's deeds and positions him as one who mirrors God above. It's a poem that is used to visually and verbally adorn the manuscript. It's also descriptive in that it selectively highlights certain features of the codex. But is it ekphrastic? I suggest the answer is both no and yes. It's not an ekphrasis, but I hope to have demonstrated that it possesses qualities that can be identified as ekphrastic image building. These features, while not ekphrastic in and of themselves, serve as signposts for an audience to look beyond the physical image and object and to perceive the inner meanings and truths within them, invoking the viewer, following an ekphrastic structure, and emphasizing the materiality and making of the object are all features of ekphrasis that move beyond description and begin to produce the vividness needed for the listener's imagination. They are the building blocks to help the listener perceive the real and imagined image. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brad, for this fantastic presentation, for this very rich talk. And thank you for proposing a fresh approach to the reading of some book epigrams in light of literary ekphrasis, but also in light, of course, of works of art. It's been fantastic. Thank you. I guess there are questions or elements to discuss. Floris, please.
Thank you, Brad. That was really terrific, and I really enjoyed every part of it. I guess I have two questions. The first one is I was a little bit surprised that you did not take the ultimate step and say, okay, the proposition of Shevchenko that there was a lost image must be completely discarded, because what the epigram really talks about is the whole book. I mean, and then you don't really need an image to fill that void. It is really about the parchment, about these different scenes of all the saints, and so it completely coincides with what you would expect of a book epigram about the whole book. And that, I think, has been the misunderstanding of Shevchenko, that he did not see this epigram really as a book epigram, but was expecting a specific image next to it. So, in line of what you were explaining, actually, I would just not be too timid, actually, to the ultimate step and say, okay, the proposition of Shevchenko must actually be discarded. And the second question is, this is just because what you said has been so thought-provoking, and this poem is indeed many things. What you can also see is a structure that is very typical for hymns and for prayers, where it's been said that God does a thing. Now the human, the patron does also a thing. And then in the third part, and even there's in the Greek even a pointer to that very typical introductory word Allah, with which a prayer begins. Then the third part is a kind of request, so that all the saints that are being depicted here by the work of Basil may help him in his life and endeavors. That doesn't detract anything from what you have been saying now about ekphrasis and the ekphrastic elements in this epigram. I think it does not exclude each other at all, but it may be another layer of this very rich and very sophisticated epigram. So yeah, these will be my remarks. Thanks for a fascinating lecture.
Yeah, thank you, Floris. I agree that I think there are multiple factors here that are contributing to the construction of this epigram that, yeah, certainly not. And that's what I hope to also achieve, that, you know, it's not all about trying to do this ekphrastic move, but that there are these other factors that are also woven in here. I didn't really make that leap in terms of, you know, arguing against Shevchenko that an image would even be necessary. But I think that's the case, and that's kind of where I end up here, that an image isn't really necessary for this particular epigram. And I think you make a good point that you know, book epigrams being sort of peculiar on their own and how they are handled. And so I think this would be you know, really kind of treating this as a book epigram, not as something that's an epigram necessarily on like what we might find in other contexts. Yeah. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Are there more questions? Well, then I would like to go back to what you said at the beginning of your talk, Brad, about the definition of ekphrastic epigram, because you were questioning whether such a thing exists actually. And I wonder, on the basis of your very large expertise on epigrams on objects, whether such a definition makes sense, like a ekphrastic epigram for inscriptional epigrams, because what we discussed here, of course, is book epigrams, so epigrams written in books. So that makes these epigrams a bit special in this respect, also in terms of space, right? There are less constraints in a book than on an object. So would you could you draw any conclusion or share any reflection on ekphrastic epigrams on a more general level?
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I don't know whether it is appropriate to even use the phrase ekphrastic epigram, because I mean, at least for Byzantine studies, and that could cause some confusion. And I think more and more scholars are kind of moving away from that terminology. Yeah, and what I know more of are not necessarily book epigrams, and so it's what I find too is for book epigrams you do have a little bit more. You aren't so constrained by space as you would like maybe on an object, where you have only sort of a limited number of surface area. Here you've got a lot of surface area because you've got a lot of folios you could work with. So space the space issue could be sort of rectified in that way. But I think in one thing I did try to bring out is sort of thinking about how, if it's an appropriate way to say this, is that could the sort of disposition, the placement of the epigram also contribute to its ekphrastic qualities? And so, what I try to bring out here with this particular epigram on the Menilogen, that it is by itself on this folio, and that to kind of engage with any kind of image, if there was an image, I mean, you really have to kind of turn away from it. With other kinds of objects and monuments in which we have inscriptions or epigrams on the monument itself, you're looking at the monument, you're looking at the thing, and sort of, and a lot of times the placement can kind of guide your viewing of particular aspects of that object. So in some ways, I wonder if like the kind of physical layout of an epigram on an object can kind of guide your thinking. Here it's about the absence, I guess. Here it's kind of focusing your mind on just the words here, whereas on other objects, and I work on reliquaries primarily, that the inscription, as it sort of wraps the object, it sort of kind of guides your view of it. And so I wonder to what extent that could also be ekphrastic, or at least like contributing to the kind of descriptive qualities, because it's kind of forcing you to turn the object and look at it from multiple perspectives. I like descriptive epigram. That's probably the better, more neutral term to use. But I just sort of wanted to play with this idea that are there elements of ekphrasis in epigrams at all? And I cited Henry Maguire in his work on art and eloquence in Byzantium, and he's really looking at text and how it influences art. But, if we look to Ivan Derpich's work, he has also pointed out how something like Ethopoeia has sort of found its way into epigrams and sort of influences the sort of first person speech of epigrams. And that's something that we find in the later Byzantine period. So I think there are these kinds of rhetorical elements that could enter into epigrams and sort of abbreviated forms in alternate forms. But whether we can sort of call, in this case, call them ekphrastic epigrams, that might be another matter. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Well, thank you for your answer. Are there more questions? Christina.
Thank you, Rachele, and thanks for this amazing lecture. It was a pleasure for the ears, but also for the eyes to see the nations you showed us. So thank you very much. Continuing on what Floris was saying, can you please develop instead the idea that sometimes these ekphrastic elements in the epigrams can show us the evidence that there was an image supporting the epigram that is now lost for us? I was thinking, you know, to geometers, for example, and the epigram of the 40 martyrs, the very famous one, but I'm sure you have other examples to add maybe, so thanks.
Oh yes, good question. You know, the one, I mean, let's go stay on book epigrams here. You know, the one thing that is kind of remarkable about book epigrams is that we have so many reused epigrams, and that sort of show up in different contexts. And then they're attached to kind of these standard images, you know, so we'd have like these epigrams on the four evangelists, and then they would be attached to these evangelist portraits in gospel books. And, you know, if you read these epigrams alone, we might sort of sense that there's an image. I mean, if we don't even look at the image and we just sort of read the epigram, it does kind of suggest that there's an image, but it's kind of like it doesn't really need the image. But then the images are sort of standardized in some ways that if they brought together, it could sort of, you know, work with a variety of styles and iconographic layouts of these evangelist portraits. And, you know, I don't really know how to answer your question very well, but I think something like these reused epigrams might kind of complicate this idea of to what extent do epigrams actually describe images. You know, this is the Menilogen epigram is different because it seems to be like this is the epigram. It's made for the manuscript that it was designed to be made for, and so it does have kind of a very peculiar and idiosyncratic way of talking about this image, so or an imagined image. But yeah, maybe that's a question I could throw back to you all, the experts on book epigrams. That how do you what do you think about these reused epigrams, and how do you see them and their relationship to images?
I feel being addressed. I think it perfectly underscores your point, Brad. What we see there, we even sometimes see that there are book epigrams on let's say subjects that are associated to the book, but not that much the book. So, for example, you would have epigrams on psalters, even with books that only contain commentaries on the psalms. So I think that there you have the same. I mean, everybody knew, of course, the psalter. You didn't literally have to have the psalter there in order to know what was being spoken of. So also there, I think there is an appeal to the imagination of the reader, and the things that are being described did not always need to be literally physically there to invoke that experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are nuances, of course, in Byzantine art, but I think there's a lot of compositions that are so standardized that, yeah, you could sort of change these things out. There's, when Feliz is writing epigrams on evangelist portraits, I mean, it doesn't matter if he's looking at one, he's sort of probably envisioning one that is, found in many different types of manuscripts. That has a very long tradition. So yeah, in some ways you think maybe the epigram is a way that really does kind of bring out some of the different kinds of nuances of our understanding of how the image should be looked at. But, you know, again, it doesn't really matter exactly what that image is sometimes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, while I wait for more questions, I would like to briefly pick up on this with another example. There are manuscripts, gospel manuscripts containing epigrams depicting the usual iconography of evangelists, but where there are no, or even describing the symbols of the evangelists, but where there are no miniatures of the evangelists, right? So they are descriptive epigrams. They clearly point to standardized a common knowledge, although there is no picture there, no image,
right? Yeah,
to refer to.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah. Anyone else who wants to add something? To pose more questions? Well, I think we all share the feeling of having attended a wonderful lecture today. We are all very grateful to you, Brad, for everything you showed to us. I would like to invite you all to join us for our next lectures. There will be 4 more lectures this season. They will be advertised as usual through newsletters, through the social media, and of course on our website. For the time being, I thank once more Brad for his lecture and you all for being here. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you all for attending.